Welcome back for our second session talking about EMFs. I want to take a deeper dive this time into talking about specific examples of how the different types of EMF actually might impact human health, focusing on the high intensity ones that we know cause cancer, the low intensity, and then the ones that affect people with neural inflammation or neural sensitivity. Again, breaking this up just so you can kind of wrap your brain around there are different kinds of EMF. And again, EMF at certain levels is actually helpful, like the Earth's electromagnetic fields, the resonance of the Schumann forces, the flux from magma under the Earth's core. These are actually good forms of EMF. And our bodies actually give off electromagnetic fields that spread away from our body about 12 feet. One of the interesting things I learned early in my functional training was that if a mother's holding a baby in their arms and you put an EEG electrode on the mom's scalp, you can actually pick up the baby's heartbeat. As it pulses, the baby's heart will pulse, and that pulsing muscles would create an electromagnetic field that pulses at, however fast the baby's heart is going, 110, 120, whatever. And you actually pick those up in the mother's QEEG, or quantitative electroencephalogram. So there are good types of things that we can measure. I'm not talking about those at all, so don't want those to be conflated. I'll talk about the ones that cause harm. So the first ones I want to talk about are the high intensity ones that we know cause cancer. There's the ionizing ones, which are the one that break chemical bonds, that break down DNA, cause DNA fragility. And then high intensity non-ionizing, which are your radio waves, microwaves, cell tower type stuff. Those are the two type we're talking about right now. Occupational studies have shown, we've known for a while, that the high intensity radio frequencies from radio towers, particularly in World War II, actually can induce gliomas, which are brain tumors in adults. And interesting enough, kids are more sensitive to these kind of radiation because smaller kids, the skull's a little thicker, and they're more sensitive to this kind of radiation, resulting in glioblastoma multiforme, which is the most aggressive form of brain cancer. And according to the IARC, these kind of radio waves are classified as a group 2B carcinogen. So those who doubt, this literally there's an organization, international organization, who's classified these as a group 2B carcinogen. So again, high intensity radio waves or ionizing radiation. And another thing that's interesting is that the EMFs can actually cause oxidative stress on your cardiovascular system. So we've seen, if you've heard of inflammation, reactive oxygen species, that might be a term, nitric oxide, endothelial dysfunction. These are all terms that we look at different parts of the cardiovascular system. And high intensity electromagnetic fields or ionizing radiation cause inflammation at all these levels, so that's associated with an increased risk for cardiovascular disease and these higher energy. And then children, I've already mentioned. Another thing about kids' exposure to ionizing radiation is the story with ionizing radiation is not just the initial exposure, it's also how long you live after the exposure. So for example, if you're a kid who falls and hits their head and needs a head CT, 6-year-old child, for example, just the CT alone will increase their risk for developing a brain tumor 1 in 1,000. Now, small risk, but a real risk when you look at them over the rest of their life, versus if an elderly person falls, hits their head, and you do a CAT scan to make sure they're not bleeding, that does not increase the risk for a glioblastoma or any kind of brain tumor or cancer. So it's not just the type of exposure, ionizing or non-ionizing high intensity, it's also how long you're going to live after the exposure, which means you just want to minimize this kind of exposure, especially when you're young, which might be part of the issues with younger people getting cancers. The next type of EMF we want to talk about is the low energy EMF associated with chronic health concerns. And this is where the devil's in the details. These are the non-ionizing associated with chronic fatigue, brain fog, sleep disturbances. We actually have seen interesting, when you part of the issue with flying, and a plane is not just traveling through time zones, you actually get a higher intensity exposure to gamma radiation, and then EMF in the plane as you're up at like 30-some thousand feet. And part of the sleep disturbance, if you ever tracked yourself sleeping in a plane or the day after, part of that jet lag is your circadian rhythms get messed up because of the exposure to electromagnetic fields that are non-ionizing high intensity. And this goes back, how's this work? It works through those voltage-gated calcium channels on your nerves, and this is how every nerve works through these voltage-gated calcium channels. And this kind of EMF, not the high intensity, non-ionizing, but the middle range intensity affects that. It also affects melatonin, it suppresses melatonin, and which affects your circadian rhythm. So, and we know that sleep-wake cycle disturbances are associated with a whole host of things. This can include your 5 megahertz, wireless phone in your house. It could be your cell phone sitting by your head. It could be, one of my friends is a financial guru guy, and the room he works in has like 8 computer screens. He's got a bunch of computers plus his Wi-Fi in there. He gets hit with a ton of EMF every day and just really jazzes up his nervous system and causes a lot of sleep disturbances. The last type of EMF I want to talk about is the neural inflammation. And the people you see with this kind are the people with chronic inflammatory response syndrome, which is all the mold, which also includes breast implant illness, includes vaccine-related illness, biotoxins, which could be diesel and aerotoxic syndrome, could be Gulf War syndrome, individuals that are 9/11 first responders at the Twin Towers event. Anybody with these biotoxin-related inflammatory things, mold, Lyme, a whole host. These are the people that become biologically sensitive to the background EMF that you have just in the environment that most of us don't feel. So one of my colleagues was talking about how he had issues with some of the self-driving cars because of the EMF that he couldn't handle driving in one of those out in Phoenix because of its impact on his nervous system. People like this also have things like mast cell activation syndrome and autonomic imbalance. So one of the interesting things about mast cell activation syndrome is that your body becomes sensitized to chemical exposure, toxins like mold, but even EMF. And so some people will respond to low-level, non-ionizing, non-high intensity, but because the nervous system is so inflamed, they are reacting. And a lot of those individuals, the answer is not blocking everything, which we'll talk about in the third session here, but it's brain retraining, calming their brain down through whatever kind of brain retraining system you choose to use. And these individuals, the dysregulated nervous system hit by the EMF increases inflammation, increases the breakdown of the blood-brain barrier, and that can be primarily induced by high-intensity EMF or secondarily induced by a neurologic system that's sensitive and exposed to EMF. So hopefully you get those two differences. It can be higher intensity or lower intensity in a inflamed system. And one of the ways to think about this is from the functional medicine perspective is we use limbic retraining, we use dynamic neural retraining, we use primal trust, we use breath work, we use a whole different host of ways to retrain the brain. And if you have a history of trauma, physical, sexual, emotional abuse, a high ACE score that already sets your autonomic nervous system on high alert, sometimes a big EMF exposure in one environment, like you stay in a hotel that's right by a cell tower, can start activating things. And then all of a sudden now you're sensitized to the low energy ones. So it's key to keep all these things in mind because not all EMF sensitivity is the same, and it also depends on what illnesses you're dealing with. The very last section I want to talk about ways to help mitigate your reaction to these things. But just be thinking about this. The EMF sensitivity is real for many people. Most people it's not. Be glad it's not. There's a difference between the ionizing, high level intensity, high intensity, non-ionizing, the middle, and most people have issues with the low intensity stuff that acts biological systems that are dysregulated, which is unfortunately a lot of people we work with in our clinics. So anyway, the last section will be about ways you can actually work on mitigating the risks of EMF exposure. Take care and we'll talk to you soon.